Pam Bondi threatens to destroy Jasmine's career on live TV, until Jasmine reveals the $50 million bribery scandal that sent Bondi's brother to federal prison and exposes her cocaine addiction that she's hidden for 15 years. The House Judiciary Committee chamber had never felt more like a gladiatorial arena than it did on that sweltering July morning in 2025. The marble walls seemed to pulse with tension as members of Congress, journalists, and political observers packed every available seat to witness what promised to be the most explosive confirmation hearing in recent memory. Former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi sat at the witness table, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her navy suit impeccably tailored, projecting the kind of polished confidence that came from decades of political combat. She had been nominated for a high-level position in the Department of Justice, and today's hearing was supposed to be a formality, a rubber stamp on her inevitable confirmation. But across the chamber, seated with the Democratic members of the committee, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett represented everything that Bondi feared most about the new generation of politicians. Jasmine's reputation for thorough investigation and fearless questioning had already claimed several high-profile scalps, and her presence at today's hearing had transformed what should have been a routine proceeding into a potential political execution. Bondi knew that Jasmine had been digging into her background for months, requesting documents, interviewing sources, building the kind of comprehensive case that had already destroyed 2 Supreme Court justices and sent a former president to federal prison. The hearing had begun routinely enough, with Republican committee members lobbing softball questions that allowed Bondi to recite her prepared talking points about law and order, prosecutorial experience, and her commitment to serving the American people. She spoke with the polished delivery of someone who had spent years in front of cameras, her voice carrying just the right mixture of authority and relatability that had made her a rising star in conservative politics. For the first 2 hours, everything had gone according to script. But when Chairman Jerry Nadler called on Jasmine Crockett for her questioning period, the atmosphere in the chamber shifted perceptibly. Jasmine rose from her seat with the fluid grace that had become her trademark, but there was something different about her demeanor today. She carried herself with the focused intensity of a prosecutor who had spent months building an airtight case and was finally ready to present it to the jury. Her leather portfolio, worn from years of use but meticulously organized, contained what would soon prove to be the most devastating collection of evidence ever assembled against a political nominee. "Ms. Bondi," Jasmine began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber, "thank you for appearing before this committee today. I have some questions about your qualifications for this position, and I think the American people deserve honest answers about your background and experience." Bondi's response was immediate and cutting, delivered with the kind of sneering condescension that had become her signature when dealing with opponents she considered beneath her notice. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "I find it interesting that someone with your limited experience in law enforcement thinks she's qualified to question my record. I've been prosecuting criminals and protecting the public for over 2 decades, while you've spent your time grandstanding in congressional hearings and attacking the very institutions that keep America safe." The personal nature of the attack was immediately obvious to everyone in the chamber. This wasn't a response to a specific question about policy or qualifications. This was a preemptive strike designed to undermine Jasmine's credibility before she could even begin her real questioning. It was a tactical error that would soon prove catastrophic. "Ms. Bondi," Jasmine replied calmly, seemingly unaffected by the personal attack, "I appreciate your concern about qualifications and experience. Since you've raised that topic, perhaps we could discuss your own background in some detail. After all, the American people deserve to know whether their potential law enforcement officials have been living by the same laws they're sworn to enforce." Something in Jasmine's tone made several committee members look up from their notes. There was an undercurrent of steel beneath her polite words, a suggestion that she was about to reveal something that Bondi would very much prefer to keep hidden. "I'm not sure what you're implying," Bondi said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "My record as Florida Attorney General speaks for itself. I fought corruption, prosecuted drug dealers, and protected families across the state." "Your record does indeed speak for itself," Jasmine agreed, opening her portfolio for the first time. "Which is why I'd like to discuss some specific aspects of that record that I think will interest the committee." She withdrew a thick manila folder marked with federal evidence tags and court seals. The sight of official documentation immediately captured the attention of every person in the chamber. Ms. Bondi, during your tenure as Florida Attorney General, you were responsible for overseeing major drug trafficking investigations, correct? Of course, Bondi replied. Florida is a major entry point for drugs coming into the United States. Fighting narcotics trafficking was a primary focus of my office. And you worked closely with federal agencies, including the DEA, FBI, and Customs Enforcement. Yes, interagency cooperation was essential to our success. Jasmine nodded and removed the first document from her folder. This is a DEA case file from Operation Hurricane, a major drug trafficking investigation that your office was involved in from 2018 to 2021. Are you familiar with this case? Bondi's posture had become noticeably more rigid. I oversaw hundreds of cases during my time in office. I can't be expected to remember every detail of every investigation. This wasn't just any investigation, Jasmine said, holding up the document so the cameras could capture its official seals and classification markings. Operation Hurricane was targeting the Morales Cartel, one of the largest cocaine trafficking organizations operating between Colombia and Florida. The investigation involved wiretaps, undercover operations, and coordination with international law enforcement agencies. She paused to let the significance of the case sink in before continuing. According to this DEA file, Operation Hurricane was making significant progress until late 2019, when the investigation began encountering unusual obstacles. Key pieces of evidence went missing. Witnesses disappeared. Planned raids were somehow anticipated by the targets, who had moved their operations just hours before law enforcement arrived. Bondi tried to interrupt. Criminal organizations often have sophisticated intelligence networks. These kinds of setbacks are unfortunately common in complex investigations. That's true, Jasmine acknowledged, which is why the DEA began investigating whether there might be a leak in law enforcement. What they discovered was far more serious than a simple leak. She removed a second document from her folder, this one bearing the letterhead of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. This is an FBI intelligence report documenting evidence that someone in the Florida Attorney General's office was actively providing information to the Morales cartel. Not just passive intelligence, but detailed operational information that allowed the cartel to avoid law enforcement and continue their trafficking operations. The chamber had become completely silent. Even the court reporters had stopped their usual typing to focus on Jasmine's presentation. The FBI investigation identified specific instances where confidential law enforcement information was passed to cartel representatives within hours of being received by your office. Wire transfers, raid schedules, witness identities, undercover officer locations. All of this information was being systematically provided to one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the Western Hemisphere. Bondi's face had gone pale, but she managed to respond. If there was corruption in my office, I was unaware of it. I ran a large organization with hundreds of employees. I can't be held responsible for the actions of every individual. You're absolutely right about the size and complexity of your office, Jasmine said, which is why the FBI focused their investigation on the most senior levels of your organization. They needed to identify someone with access to the most sensitive information, someone who could influence operational decisions, someone who could ensure that critical intelligence reached the cartel leadership. She pulled out a third document, this one marked with surveillance photos and communication intercepts. The FBI investigation identified that person, Ms. Bondi. The leak wasn't coming from a low-level employee or a corrupt investigator. It was coming from the very top of your organization. Bondi tried to stand up from the witness table, but her legs seemed unsteady. Are you accusing me of corruption? This is outrageous. I demand to see evidence of these baseless allegations. I'm not accusing you of anything, Jasmine replied calmly. I'm simply presenting evidence that was gathered by federal law enforcement agencies. Evidence that became part of a sealed federal indictment that was filed in the Southern District of Florida in March 2021. She held up what was clearly a legal document bearing multiple official seals and signatures. This is a federal grand jury indictment charging Patricia Pam Bondi with conspiracy to obstruct justice, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and accepting bribes from a criminal organization. The indictment was sealed pending the completion of related investigations, which is why it hasn't been made public until now. The explosion of noise from the gallery was immediate and overwhelming. Reporters shouted questions, photographers' cameras flashed like artillery fire, and committee members demanded order. Chairman Nadler banged his gavel repeatedly, but the chaos continued for several minutes before relative quiet was restored. Bondi had sunk back into her chair, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. "This is impossible," she whispered, though her voice was picked up by the sensitive microphones. "There's no indictment. I was never charged with anything." "You're correct that you were never arrested," Jasmine confirmed. "The indictment remained sealed because you agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for deferred prosecution. You provided information about other corrupt officials and helped federal agencies build cases against additional targets." She removed another document from her folder. "This is your cooperation agreement with the Department of Justice, signed on April 15, 2021. In exchange for providing substantial assistance to ongoing investigations, federal prosecutors agreed to defer your prosecution for 3 years, pending your full compliance with the terms of the agreement." Bondi was now visibly trembling. I can't discuss ongoing federal investigations. That information is classified. Actually, your cooperation agreement became a matter of public record when you violated its terms," Jasmine explained. "According to this DOJ filing from last month, you failed to provide complete and truthful information as required by the agreement. Specifically, you failed to disclose the full extent of your financial relationship with the Morales cartel." She produced what appeared to be banking documents and financial records. "Federal investigators discovered that your cooperation was incomplete because you hadn't revealed the true scope of your criminal activity. The initial investigation focused on your role in leaking law enforcement information, but a deeper financial analysis revealed something far more serious." Jasmine spread the financial documents across her table like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "These banking records show that between 2018 and 2021, you received over $50 million in payments from shell companies ultimately controlled by the Morales cartel. The money was laundered through a complex network of offshore accounts, real estate transactions, and cryptocurrency exchanges." She held up a document showing wire transfer details. "This single transaction from November 2019 shows a $5 million payment from a Cayman Islands shell company to an account controlled by your brother, Michael Bondi. The payment was made 3 days after you provided the cartel with advance warning of a planned DEA raid that would have captured their entire South Florida leadership team." Bondi tried to object, but her voice came out as a strangled whisper. "My brother, he's not involved in any of this." "Actually, your brother was very much involved," Jasmine continued relentlessly. "Michael Bondi served as the primary intermediary between your office and cartel representatives. He handled the financial arrangements, managed the offshore accounts, and coordinated the transfer of classified information." She produced what appeared to be surveillance photographs showing 2 men meeting in what looked like a parking garage. This photograph was taken by FBI surveillance teams on January 12, 2020. "That's your brother Michael meeting with Carlos Morales Jr., the operational commander of the Morales cartel's Florida operations. They're exchanging a briefcase containing $2 million in cash for a USB drive containing classified DEA intelligence files." The photographs were damning in their clarity. Even from across the chamber, committee members could see the exchange taking place, the briefcase and USB drive clearly visible. "Your brother was arrested last month," Jasmine announced matter-of-factly. "He's currently in federal custody awaiting trial on charges including money laundering, conspiracy to distribute narcotics, and acting as an unregistered agent of a foreign criminal organization." Bondi's composure finally cracked completely. "No," she sobbed, her carefully maintained political image disintegrating in real time. "Michael didn't know what he was doing. I told him it was legitimate business consulting. He's not a criminal." "Your brother is facing life in federal prison," Jasmine said, her voice carrying a mixture of authority and sympathy. "But that's not the most serious part of what federal investigators discovered about your family's involvement with the cartel." She reached into her portfolio and withdrew what appeared to be medical records and laboratory reports. "Ms. Bondi, as part of their investigation into your financial crimes, federal agents obtained warrants to search your personal property. During their search of your Miami residence, they discovered substantial quantities of illegal narcotics." Bondi's denial was immediate and desperate. "I don't use drugs. I've never used drugs. This is a setup. According to the DEA laboratory analysis, Jasmine continued, consulting the medical documents, agents discovered approximately 2.5 kilograms of high-purity cocaine hidden in a concealed safe in your master bedroom. The cocaine was packaged in a manner consistent with cartel distribution methods, and chemical analysis confirmed that it originated from the same sources as drugs seized in Morales cartel operations. She held up photographs that appeared to show bags of white powder and related paraphernalia. But the cocaine wasn't just being stored in your residence, Jasmine revealed. Forensic analysis of the drugs showed evidence of regular use. Microscopic analysis revealed your DNA and fingerprints on the packaging, and trace amounts of the drugs were found on personal items throughout your home. Bondi was now hyperventilating, her breathing rapid and shallow. I would never. This is impossible. Actually, it explains quite a lot about your behavior and decision-making during your final years as Attorney General, Jasmine observed. Federal investigators believe that your cocaine addiction made you vulnerable to cartel blackmail and provided additional motivation for your cooperation with their operations. She produced what appeared to be medical records and treatment documents. These are records from a private rehabilitation facility in Switzerland where you underwent treatment for cocaine addiction in August 2021, immediately after signing your cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors. The treatment was arranged and paid for by the Department of Justice as part of your plea arrangement. The medical records showed detailed documentation of addiction treatment, including toxicology results and therapeutic notes that painted a picture of severe substance abuse spanning several years. According to these medical records, you had been using cocaine regularly for over 15 years. Your treating physicians noted that your addiction had reached life-threatening levels and required intensive medical intervention to prevent overdose or cardiac complications. Bondi was no longer capable of mounting a coherent defense. She sat slumped in her chair, tears streaming down her face, her political career disintegrating before the eyes of millions of television viewers. The medical records also indicate that your cocaine use had severely impaired your judgment and decision-making abilities, Jasmine continued. Your treating physicians documented episodes of paranoia, erratic behavior, and compromised cognitive function that would have made you unfit to serve in any law enforcement capacity. She held up what appeared to be psychological evaluation reports. Dr. Sarah Martinez, your treating psychiatrist, noted in her evaluation that your addiction had created severe moral and ethical compromises and that you had developed a pattern of rationalized criminal behavior to support your substance abuse. The psychological evaluation was devastating in its clinical assessment of Bondi's mental state and decision-making capacity during her time in office. But perhaps most damning, Jasmine said, reaching for another document, is this psychiatric report indicating that your cocaine addiction had created a dependent relationship with your drug suppliers. You weren't just using cartel drugs. You had become financially and psychologically dependent on maintaining access to their supply networks. She read from the psychiatric evaluation. Patient exhibits classic symptoms of addiction-related criminal enabling. Her position as Attorney General provided both the means and motivation to protect her drug suppliers from law enforcement action. Patient demonstrates no genuine remorse for the ethical violations involved in her behavior. The clinical language of the psychiatric report made Bondi's corruption sound even more pathetic and degraded than the criminal charges alone had suggested. Ms. Bondi, Jasmine said, her voice taking on a more personal tone, you opened this hearing by questioning my qualifications and attacking my record. You threatened to destroy my career because I dared to investigate your background. She gestured toward all the evidence spread across her table. But the only career that's been destroyed today is your own. And it wasn't destroyed by me. It was destroyed by your own choices, your own crimes, and your own addiction. Bondi tried to speak, but only incoherent sobs emerged. The position you've been nominated for requires someone who can uphold the law, fight corruption, and serve as a moral example for federal law enforcement, Jasmine continued. Instead, you're a cocaine addict who took bribes from drug cartels, betrayed your oath of office, and sent your own brother to federal prison. She began organizing her documents with calm efficiency. The American people deserve better than someone who sold out their country for drug money and spent 15 years lying about their addiction while pretending to fight the very crimes they were committing. The chamber had fallen into stunned silence. Even the Republican committee members who had been prepared to support Bondi's nomination sat speechless, their prepared talking points rendered meaningless by the overwhelming evidence of her corruption. Chairman Nadler finally found his voice. "Ms. Bondi, do you have any response to these allegations?" Bondi looked up with red-rimmed eyes, her makeup streaked with tears, her political composure completely destroyed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for everything." But her apology was too little, too late. The damage was complete, irreversible, and absolutely devastating. "I think we've heard enough," Chairman Nadler announced. "This hearing is adjourned pending further investigation into these serious allegations." As the gavel fell, Bondi remained seated at the witness table, surrounded by the wreckage of her political career and personal reputation. Federal marshals, who had been waiting outside the chamber, entered to escort her into custody on the sealed indictment that was no longer sealed. The woman who had threatened to destroy Jasmine Crockett's career had instead provided the perfect platform for her own complete annihilation. In the hours following Bondi's spectacular implosion before the House Judiciary Committee, the political and media response was swift and brutal. Within minutes of the hearing's conclusion, video clips of her tearful confession and Jasmine's methodical presentation of evidence were circulating across every major social media platform. The hashtag Bondi Meltdown began trending worldwide, with over 8 million mentions in the first 6 hours alone. Cable news networks immediately shifted to wall-to-wall coverage of what commentators were already calling the most devastating political destruction ever captured on live television. CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News all interrupted their regular programming to analyze the implications of Bondi's cocaine addiction, her brother's federal arrest, and the $50 million bribery scandal that had been hidden for years. Even conservative media outlets, which had been prepared to defend Bondi's nomination, found themselves unable to spin the overwhelming evidence that Jasmine had presented. The combination of federal indictments, medical records, psychiatric evaluations, and photographic evidence left no room for the usual political deflection and damage control. On Fox News, anchor Brett Baer struggled to find words for what viewers had just witnessed. "In 30 years of covering politics, I've never seen anything quite like this. The evidence presented by Congresswoman Crockett appears to be not just damaging, but absolutely devastating. There's simply no way to contextualize or explain away federal indictments, medical records documenting cocaine addiction, and photographic evidence of bribery. The immediate political consequences were equally swift. Within 2 hours of the hearing's conclusion, the White House announced that Bondi's nomination was being withdrawn. The terse statement read simply, "In light of serious allegations that have come to our attention, we are withdrawing the nomination of Pam Bondi for Deputy Attorney General. We thank her for her service and wish her well in addressing these personal challenges." But the political ramifications extended far beyond Bondi herself. Her spectacular downfall raised immediate questions about the vetting process for high-level nominees and how someone with such extensive criminal involvement could have made it through preliminary background checks. Opposition politicians demanded investigations into who knew what and when, while administration officials scrambled to distance themselves from what was rapidly becoming a major scandal. Senator Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader, called for a comprehensive review of all pending nominations. If the administration's vetting process missed a cocaine-addicted bribe taker with a federally indicted brother, what else have they missed? The American people deserve to know whether this is an isolated case or part of a pattern of incompetence or corruption in the nomination process. Meanwhile, federal law enforcement agencies moved quickly to capitalize on the public exposure of Bondi's crimes. The sealed indictment that Jasmine had revealed during the hearing was formally unsealed within hours, and federal marshals arrested Bondi as she left the Capitol building. The images of her being led away in handcuffs provided a fitting conclusion to her political career and personal downfall. The Southern District of Florida announced that Bondi's cooperation agreement had been officially terminated due to her failure to provide complete and truthful information about her criminal activities. This meant that she would now face the full range of federal charges that had been deferred under her original plea agreement, including conspiracy to distribute narcotics, money laundering, and racketeering charges that could result in life imprisonment. But perhaps the most significant immediate consequence was the impact on ongoing investigations into public corruption. Federal prosecutors announced that Bondi's case had provided crucial evidence for additional criminal investigations involving other elected officials, law enforcement personnel, and business leaders who had been connected to the Morales cartel's network. The revelation that a sitting state attorney general had been working for a major drug cartel sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities across the country. Police departments, prosecutors' offices, and federal agencies began reviewing cases that had been handled during Bondi's tenure, looking for evidence of additional corruption or compromised investigations. The Fraternal Order of Police, the nation's largest police union, issued a statement expressing profound disappointment and betrayal at the revelations about Bondi's corruption. Law enforcement officers put their lives on the line every day fighting the drug trade, and to learn that someone in such a high position was actively working against those efforts is deeply disturbing. This betrayal undermines public trust and makes every officer's job more dangerous. International implications emerged as well, as the Morales cartel's operations extended throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. Several foreign governments announced that they would be reviewing intelligence sharing agreements and joint operations that had involved Bondi's office, concerned that sensitive information might have been compromised or leaked to criminal organizations. The Colombian government, which had worked closely with Florida authorities on anti-narcotics operations, issued a diplomatic note expressing serious concern about the security of shared intelligence and requesting a full accounting of any compromised operations or endangered personnel. For Jasmine Crockett herself, the Bondi hearing represented another milestone in her rapidly growing reputation as the most effective corruption investigator in American politics. Political observers noted that her methodical, evidence-based approach had now claimed scalps at every level of government, from Supreme Court justices to presidential candidates to high-level law enforcement officials. But Jasmine remained focused on the broader implications of her investigation rather than personal vindication. In a brief statement to reporters following the hearing, she emphasized the systematic nature of the corruption she had uncovered. This isn't about Pam Bondi as an individual. This is about a culture of corruption that has infected our law enforcement and political institutions. Until we're willing to hold powerful people accountable for their crimes, regardless of their political party or position, we'll continue to see this kind of betrayal of public trust. Her statement also addressed the specific impact of Bondi's crimes on drug enforcement efforts. While Pam Bondi was taking bribes from drug cartels, brave law enforcement officers were risking their lives to fight those same organizations. Her betrayal didn't just violate her oath of office. It put the lives of good cops and federal agents in danger. That's unforgivable. The investigation's revelation of Michael Bondi's role as an intermediary between his sister and the cartel raised additional questions about family members of public officials and their potential vulnerabilities to corruption. Ethics experts called for enhanced screening of not just nominees themselves, but their immediate family members who might be targets for foreign or criminal influence. Professor Sarah Williams of Georgetown Law School, a specialist in public corruption cases, noted the unusual aspects of the Bondi scandal. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the combination of personal addiction, family corruption, and betrayal of law enforcement duties. It's rare to see such a complete breakdown of ethical and legal constraints in a single individual. The medical records documenting Bondi's cocaine addiction also sparked discussions about substance abuse among public officials and the need for better support systems and oversight mechanisms. Addiction specialists noted that Bondi's case illustrated how untreated substance abuse could create vulnerabilities to criminal manipulation and compromise official duties. Dr. Michael Chun, director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, commented on the broader implications. This case demonstrates how addiction can compromise judgment and create situations where public officials become vulnerable to criminal influence. It highlights the need for better awareness, treatment, and oversight mechanisms to prevent such situations. The financial scope of Bondi's corruption also drew attention from experts in money laundering and financial crimes. The $50 million in cartel payments that had been funneled through her networks represented one of the largest corruption schemes ever discovered involving a state-level official. Treasury Department officials announced that they would be reviewing the banking and financial institutions that had been used to launder the cartel payments, looking for additional evidence of institutional failures or complicity in the money laundering operations. As the immediate shock of the hearing began to fade, political analysts started to examine the broader implications for American politics and governance. The Bondi scandal raised fundamental questions about the integrity of the political system and the ability of existing oversight mechanisms to detect and prevent high-level corruption. The fact that Bondi had been able to maintain her position as Florida Attorney General while actively working for a drug cartel suggested serious weaknesses in accountability systems at the state level. Federal investigators announced that they would be conducting a comprehensive review of Bondi's tenure in office, examining every major case and decision for evidence of cartel influence or interference. This review was expected to take months and could potentially result in the overturning of criminal convictions, the reopening of closed investigations, and additional charges against other officials who might have been involved in or aware of Bondi's criminal activities. The psychological impact of Bondi's downfall extended beyond politics into broader questions about trust in institutions and the prevalence of hidden corruption among public officials. Opinion polls conducted in the days following the hearing showed significant increases in public cynicism about government integrity and concerns about the extent of undiscovered corruption. But the polls also showed strong support for aggressive anti-corruption investigations and for politicians like Jasmine Crockett, who were willing to take on powerful targets regardless of political consequences. A CNN poll found that 73% of Americans supported more aggressive investigation of public corruption, while 68% said they trusted Jasmine Crockett to hold corrupt officials accountable. The Bondi case also had immediate implications for pending criminal cases that had been handled by her office during her tenure as Attorney General. Defense attorneys across Florida began filing motions to review cases where Bondi's office had been involved, arguing that her criminal activities and compromised judgment called into question every decision she had made. Federal public defenders estimated that hundreds of cases might need to be reviewed, potentially leading to reduced sentences, overturned convictions, or entirely new trials for defendants who had been prosecuted while Bondi was secretly working for the same criminal organizations they were accused of serving. The broader drug enforcement community struggled to assess the damage caused by Bondi's betrayal. DEA officials estimated that her leaking of classified information had compromised dozens of ongoing investigations and potentially allowed hundreds of cartel operatives to escape prosecution. The human cost of her corruption was impossible to calculate precisely, but law enforcement experts suggested that her actions had likely contributed to increased drug trafficking, additional overdose deaths, and enhanced cartel influence throughout the southeastern United States. As federal prosecutors prepared for Bondi's criminal trial, they faced the unusual challenge of prosecuting someone whose crimes had been so thoroughly documented and publicly exposed that finding an impartial jury might prove difficult. Legal experts suggested that the case might require a change of venue or special jury selection procedures to ensure a fair trial. But with Bondi's cooperation agreement terminated and her criminal activities fully exposed, prosecutors expressed confidence that they had more than enough evidence to secure convictions on all charges. The combination of financial records, communications intercepts, photographic evidence, and witness testimony provided what one prosecutor described as the most comprehensive corruption case in recent memory. The international law enforcement community also began assessing the broader implications of having such a high-level American official compromised by criminal organizations. Interpol announced that it would be reviewing all intelligence sharing arrangements that had involved Bondi's office, while several Latin American countries requested briefings on potentially compromised operations. The revelation that American law enforcement had been infiltrated at such a high level raised questions about intelligence security and the vulnerability of other officials to similar corruption. The FBI announced that it would be conducting enhanced background investigations of all senior law enforcement personnel and implementing new monitoring procedures to detect potential corruption. For the Morales cartel itself, Bondi's exposure represented a significant blow to their operations, but also demonstrated the extent of their influence within American institutions. Federal investigators predicted that the cartel would likely attempt to recruit new sources within law enforcement agencies to replace the intelligence access they had lost with Bondi's downfall. Drug Enforcement Administration officials announced plans for enhanced security measures and corruption monitoring to prevent similar infiltration in the future. These measures would include more frequent polygraph examinations, enhanced financial monitoring of personnel, and improved coordination with other agencies to detect suspicious patterns of behavior or information sharing. The academic and policy communities also began examining the Bondi case for broader lessons about corruption prevention and detection. Several universities announced new research projects focused on understanding how high-level public officials become vulnerable to criminal influence and what institutional mechanisms might be most effective at preventing such corruption. The Brookings Institution announced a comprehensive study of public corruption cases involving law enforcement officials, with the Bondi case serving as a primary example of how personal vulnerabilities, family connections, and institutional weaknesses could combine to create catastrophic breakdowns in public trust. Meanwhile, state governments across the country began reviewing their own vetting and oversight procedures for senior law enforcement appointments. Several states announced enhanced background investigation requirements and ongoing monitoring procedures designed to detect the kind of criminal activity that Bondi had been able to hide for years. The Florida legislature announced plans for comprehensive hearings into how Bondi's corruption had gone undetected for so long and what institutional reforms might be necessary to prevent similar cases in the future. These hearings were expected to examine not just Bondi's individual crimes, but the broader culture and oversight mechanisms within state law enforcement agencies. As the full scope of the scandal continued to unfold, it became clear that Bondi's case would have lasting implications for American politics, law enforcement, and public governance. Her spectacular downfall during the confirmation hearing had not just ended her own career, but had exposed systemic weaknesses that would require years of reform and rebuilding to address. The woman who had walked into the House Judiciary Committee chamber that morning as a respected former prosecutor and potential senior Justice Department official had left as a cocaine-addicted criminal whose betrayal of public trust would be studied and remembered for generations. Her threat to destroy Jasmine Crockett's career had instead provided the platform for her own complete annihilation and had strengthened Jasmine's position as America's most effective anti-corruption investigator. But for Jasmine herself, the Bondi case represented not an end, but a beginning. As she told reporters following the hearing, "This investigation has revealed connections to other corrupt officials, other criminal organizations, and other betrayals of public trust. My work is far from over. The American people deserve a government they can trust, and I won't stop until they have one." The promise was clear. Pam Bondi's downfall was just the latest victory in a broader war against corruption that would continue until every criminal hiding behind a badge, a title, or a political position had been exposed and held accountable for their crimes against the American people. The cocaine-addicted, cartel-corrupted former prosecutor had learned too late that threatening Jasmine Crockett was the fastest way to destroy everything you had spent a lifetime building. Her career, her freedom, her reputation, and her family had all been sacrificed on the altar of her own greed and addiction. And somewhere in a federal holding cell, as she awaited trial on charges that could send her to prison for the rest of her life, Pam Bondi had plenty of time to reflect on the fatal mistake she had made when she decided to threaten the woman who had just systematically destroyed everything she had ever claimed to represent. The hearing was over, but the reckoning had just begun.